All right, today we're going to do something a little different. We're going to take a look at a single week's worth of official announcements from the Trump administration. We've gone through all the press releases, the executive orders, the reports, to really see what kind of story they tell when you put them all together.
And that brings us to our big question for this explainer. Just how much can one administration really announce in 7 days? I mean, what can actually happen in 1 week? Well, as you're about to see, the answer is a lot. We're going to cover everything from foreign policy and the economy to immigration and culture.
So to make sense of it all, we've broken everything down into 5 key themes that just kept popping up in the documents. First, this idea of projecting strength on the world stage. Then we'll look at shaping the domestic agenda, hardening the border, and defining American life. And at the end, we'll tie it all together and see what the big narrative of the week really was.
Okay, let's dive right in with that first theme, projecting strength abroad. This week, that came through in 2 major ways: military declarations and diplomatic deals.
The week kicked off with a really big foreign policy announcement. The White House declared what it called a decisive victory in Operation Epic Fury. This was a 38-day military operation against Iran. And the official statement said that all the military objectives had been achieved and a ceasefire was now in effect.
And to really drive home the scale of this thing, the administration's press release laid out some pretty staggering numbers. We're talking over 10,200 air sorties flown, more than 13,000 targets struck, and 150 Iranian warships destroyed. The message behind these numbers is crystal clear: overwhelming force.
You know, if you want to get a feel for the tone of the announcement, this quote from the Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, really says it all. He said, quote, "Iran begged for this ceasefire, and we all know it." That line pretty much perfectly captures the administration's whole narrative here, framing this as a total victory won through strength.
But foreign policy this week wasn't just about military action. The White House also rolled out a series of major bilateral deals with Hungary, and these agreements covered a lot of ground. We're talking $500 million in crude oil, a potential $20 billion nuclear deal, and even a $700 million deal for U.S. HIMARS rocket systems.
Okay, so from the world stage, let's pivot back home for our second theme, shaping the domestic agenda, with a real focus this week on deregulation and the economy.
So on the domestic front, a pretty significant announcement came from the Council on Environmental Quality. They issued new guidance on something called categorical exclusions. Now, the document itself defines these as an off-ramp from unnecessary levels of environmental review for certain projects. The administration's stated goal? To streamline permitting for big infrastructure projects and, well, cut costs.
Now, shifting gears into the digital economy, the White House Council of Economic Advisors, or CEA, dropped a report all about cryptocurrency. Specifically, it tried to answer a huge regulatory question. What would actually happen if you banned stablecoins, the type of crypto that's tied to an asset like the US dollar, from offering interest? This is a really big deal because that interest is a major reason why people hold these things.
And this is where the administration's findings get really interesting. See, a lot of people were worried that a ban like this could slash bank lending by trillions of dollars, but the CEA's model came to a completely different conclusion. It actually projected the ban would increase bank lending, albeit by a modest $2.1 billion. So, in essence, the report is arguing that all that fear about a negative economic impact is just totally overblown.
And finally, on the economic front for the week, a formal presidential memorandum came out ordering budget sequestration for the 2027 fiscal year. Now, what does that mean? Well, in plain English, it's a legal order that triggers automatic, across-the-board spending cuts for that year.
All right, our third theme was a huge focus in the communications this week, hardening the border, with a heavy emphasis on enforcement and asylum statistics.
So the administration put out this chart, and it's pretty central to their argument that their policies are completely remaking the nation's immigration courts. As you can see, that trend line shows a really steep drop, a plummet really, in the average monthly rate for decided asylum cases. And the key number driving that entire argument is just 7%. The press release flags this as the average asylum grant rate for February, calling it a historic low. The document presents this number as proof that, in its own words, activist judicial amnesty is over.
To really hammer home its enforcement message, the White House also released a document that detailed specific criminal allegations. Now, it's really important to point out that the very emotional language you see here, words like horrific, savaging, and sickening, that's all quoted directly from the official release.
The document is very explicit about linking these criminal cases to the administration's broader border policy agenda.
Okay, let's move on to our fourth section. This one covers a wider range of announcements that touch on things like culture, faith, and even national exploration.
A pretty big move this week came through an executive order titled Saving College Sports. The stated goal here is to use federal authority to bring some stability to college athletics, which the document describes as being in a state of legal chaos. The order goes on to set new federal rules for things like player eligibility and transfers.
The administration also put out a document listing actions it took to protect what it specifically calls Christian liberty. Some of the actions listed are establishing a new White House faith office, creating a task force on anti-Christian bias, banning federal funds for what the document refers to as chemical and surgical mutilation of minors, and reinstating the Mexico City policy, which, as you may know, restricts overseas abortion funding.
And the week wasn't all policy and regulation. There was also a moment of what you might call national celebration. The president held the first presidential interplanetary communication in over 50 years. He actually spoke with the NASA astronauts on the Artemis II mission as they became the first crew to orbit the moon since the Apollo days. Pretty cool.
So, after looking at all these individual announcements, from military operations to crypto regulations, what's the big picture? Let's try to pull all these threads together and look at the administration's core narrative for the week.
So yeah, when you lay it all out like this, 4 really clear pillars of action and messaging just jump right out from this 1 week of documents. You've got this constant focus on projecting military strength, an economic agenda that's all about deregulation, a very strict policy on immigration enforcement, and a real willingness to engage in cultural debates. And honestly, if you had to boil down the entire week's messaging into just one sentence, this quote from that immigration press release seems to really capture the core of the administration's whole stated philosophy. In this administration, American lives come first.
Which really leaves us with one final question to think about. From military ops and economic models to asylum rates in college sports, all of these official actions, together, they paint a picture. So when you look at all of it, what story does it tell you about a nation's priorities? Something to consider. Thanks for watching.